Imagine a nation that is actively, under severe military bombardment, like missiles in the sky, sirens blaring constantly, and the threat of just devastating modern warfare is this daily reality.
Right, the kind of existential threat where everything else just stops.
Exactly. And ask yourself what the leadership of that nation should realistically be doing. I mean, logic
Ah.
dictates they be marshaling every single available resource for national defense, right? Bracing for impact.
You would expect them to be unifying the public, yeah.
Yeah, but what if, instead of looking up at that incoming threat, the leadership actually turned inward, like quietly moving dozens of political prisoners into solitary confinement just to accelerate their executions?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's a scenario that completely shatters our conventional understanding of how a state is supposed to operate during a
It
crisis.
really does.
You expect a government under fire to consolidate its external defenses, not, wage this intensified lethal war against its own unarmed citizens.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring a super fascinating and, well, intensely complex audio source today that deals with exactly this scenario in Iran.
It's a heavy one today.
It is. Our source is a politically charged broadcast from a program called Radio Irava, and it features detailed interviews with two specific figures, Mr. Behrouz Partovi and Ms. Homeira Hesami.
Right.
The mission for us today is to really unpack this specific broadcast, to examine the underlying logic of how a faction of the Iranian opposition views this current crisis and, what they believe comes next.
But before we dive into the mechanics of their arguments, we really need to establish some clear ground rules for you listening.
Yeah, that is definitely important.
Because the source material we are analyzing today is highly partisan. I mean, it contains fierce anti-regime sentiments, a very strong critique of the exiled royal figure Reza Pahlavi, and direct advocacy for the PMOI.
That's the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran.
Exactly, as well as the broader NCRI, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. So our role here is not to take sides or, endorse any of these viewpoints.
Right. We are strictly neutral here.
We are acting entirely as your guides today, just mapping out the claims, the political blueprints, and the narratives exactly as they're laid out in this Radio Irava broadcast.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the immediate reality described at the very start of the broadcast, that jarring contrast between external war and internal executions, that is exactly where Mr. Partovi begins his analysis.
Yeah, it sets the whole tone.
It does. The broadcast details the recent executions of 4 PMOI members, Alipur, Gobadi, Tagavi, and Daneshvar. And while the world's attention is entirely focused on the geopolitics of the region, the source notes that 21 more prisoners were recently moved to solitary confinement.
And the broadcast frames these executions not just as isolated human rights abuses, but as part of this really desperate systemic reaction to a collapsing security apparatus.
Oh, wait, collapsing how? Like, what does Partovi say is actually happening?
Well, he paints a picture of a regime whose internal machinery is effectively rotting from the inside out. He cites reports claiming that 5,000 security forces and mercenaries have already deserted.
5,000.
Yeah, fleeing straight across the border to Turkey.
That imagery used to describe this internal collapse is just striking. Because when you hear descriptions in the broadcast of loyalists allegedly hiding out in empty sewer pipes.
Sewer pipes, wow.
Yeah, or like sleeping 2 or 3 to a personal car just to avoid being deployed. I mean, you aren't looking at an organized tactical retreat at that point.
No, not at all.
You're looking at a profound institutional breakdown. Like, it sounds like the captain of a ship strictly enforcing uniform codes while the hull is actively taking on water.
That's a really good way to put it.
Why spend resources on executing political prisoners when you're facing this devastating modern war? Soldiers are abandoning their posts because they recognize the state just can't manage it anymore.
And that breakdown is completely crucial to understanding the source's main thesis here regarding the executions. The broadcast basically argues that the regime is highly aware of its own internal fracturing.
Right.
Like, if your rank-and-file soldiers are fleeing to the point of hiding in drainage pipes, the leadership has a catastrophic morale problem.
Oh, for sure.
So Partovi's analysis suggests that executing highly organized opposition members is actually a calculated countermeasure to that specific problem.
So it's like they're using domestic terror as an organizational glue.
Precisely. If a military is actively fracturing, executing political dissidents isn't just about, eliminating those specific individuals.
It's a message.
Yeah, it functions as this gruesome, paralyzing psychological anchor for the regime's own ranks. It projects absolute ruthlessness, essentially telling a terrified soldier that the penalty for stepping out of line internally is far more certain than, well, the threat of a foreign missile.
Wow. And the broadcast takes that a step further, right? By identifying who the regime views as the ultimate threat.
Yeah, they do.
By focusing their lethal machinery on the PMOI and the organized resistance, the state is signaling to its loyalists that the true existential danger to their survival isn't actually the external bombardment.
Right, it's domestic.
Exactly. The real danger is the structured democratic alternative operating right there on the ground in Iran.
So the executions are, according to the source, a desperate attempt to maintain a monopoly on power by proving they still control that ultimate lever of fear.
But, if you're listening to this and wondering how a government can simply execute its way out of a crisis in the 21st century, you're hitting on the exact pivot the source makes next.
Which is a very fair question to ask.
Yeah, because the mechanics of international diplomacy have fundamentally changed. You just cannot carry out mass executions in a vacuum anymore.
Right.
The broadcast explicitly contrasts this current era with the summer of 1988, when an estimated 120,000 dissidents were massacred in Iranian prisons.
And Partovi's point about 1988 is really about the isolation of information. Back then, the world simply did not know.
The flow of news was just so slow.
Exactly. A regime could bury thousands in mass graves, and the international community would just remain largely unaware for months, sometimes even years.
But today,
Yeah, the broadcast notes that atrocities are quantified and broadcasted globally, minute by minute.
the mechanism of diplomatic fallout is just so much faster now.
Yeah, the moment the recent executions of those 4 individuals were announced, it triggered severe, rapid condemnations from the UN Special Rapporteur, from Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch.
So a single execution today creates this instantaneous geopolitical friction. It forces Western diplomats to issue sanctions. It makes any sort of economic back-channeling nearly impossible.
Right. It bankrupts their standing on the global stage.
But I actually have to push back a little on the optimism of Partovi's claim here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, if the international cost is so debilitating, and if regimes that rely entirely on brute force inevitably end up in the dustbin of history, like the broadcast claims, why hasn't the regime collapsed yet?
Yeah.
I mean, we have been hearing about this unsustainable high cost for a very long time. Does the source explain that?
What's fascinating here is that the broadcast actually addresses that exact contradiction. They frame it as a fatal paradox of survival.
A paradox.
Yeah. The regime is depicted as being entirely trapped by its own mechanisms of control. To survive the weak internally, they require the domestic terror.
Okay.
They literally have to execute dissidents to keep their own security forces from completely dissolving into chaos. However, doing that exact same action ensures their long-term destruction on the global stage.
Oh, I see. So it's a lethal calculus. They're willingly burning Wednesday's international leverage just to survive Tuesday at home.
Exactly. They are trading long-term global viability for short-term domestic survival.
And the broadcast characterizes this dynamic not as resilience, but as a regime that is entering a terminal phase. Like they are consuming their own diplomatic capital just to maintain this fragile, terrifying illusion of control over a public that's already rejected them.
Which brings up the most urgent question for anyone watching this crisis unfold. If we accept the source's premise that the regime is effectively cannibalizing itself to stay in power, who fills the vacuum?
Right. When the state machinery eventually breaks, who steps into that space?
And that question brings us right to the second half of the Radio Irava broadcast. This is where it shifts away from the regime and launches into a fierce, systematic critique of a rival opposition figure in the diaspora, Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah, the focus here completely transitions to the interview with Mrs. Homeira Hesami, and she meticulously dissects Pahlavi's recent appearance at the Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC, in the U.S.
And her critique goes way beyond just simple policy disagreements. She attacked the fundamental nature and the behavior of his entire political movement.
Because the details she provides about his supporters at this conference are pretty startling. According to the broadcast, they were aggressively blocking hallways, shouting down any dissenting Iranian voices, and constantly chanting Javed Shah, which means long live the king.
Right.
But the detail that really demands a pause here is Hesami mentioning supporters brandishing the flag of Savak, and one individual even boasting online about being a Sav of Cook.
Yeah, we really need to explain the gravity of that for a moment, because
Thought.
SAVAK was not just a neighborhood watch or some standard intelligence agency for the ousted Shah.
Definitely not.
It was a notoriously brutal, secret police force. They were infamous globally for unspeakable torture and the absolute suppression of political thought.
The historical weight of that symbol just cannot be overstated. Hesami uses that specific detail to highlight what she sees as a profound ideological disconnect.
Oh, totally.
The broadcast argues that bringing the flag of a historically brutal secret police force to an American conference dedicated to discussing the future of a free Iran. It fundamentally undermines any democratic messaging Pahlavi might be trying to project.
I mean, it's politically absurd. It would literally be like crashing a neighborhood watch meeting to loudly demand someone be crowned mayor while waving the flag of the Stasi or the KGB.
Yeah, and expecting to be greeted as a liberator.
Exactly. So the broadcast uses this to accuse Pahlavi of lacking any substantive modern plan for the Iranian people.
Hesami argues he's essentially trying to pre-sell Iran to foreign powers. Like, showing up at Western political conferences to lobby the U.S. to overthrow the regime from the outside solely so he can just be installed in the resulting vacuum.
Which naturally leads to a really crucial question about modern political influence. Because if Pahlavi's movement is as flawed and historically tone-deaf as the source claims, why are they commanding so much attention?
Right, on social media and at these huge high-profile conferences.
Right. Well, Hesami addresses this by applying a psychological and technological lens to his popularity. She explicitly labels his movement a bubble and a break on the revolution.
That break on the revolution concept is so fascinating to me. She's arguing that his massive social media presence isn't an organic groundswell of support, right?
Yeah,
It's an artificially inflated mechanism.
exactly. The source points to investigations showing these deeply unnatural spikes in his followers. We're talking massive surges of likes and retweets appearing in mere 60-second intervals.
Wow, just 60 seconds.
Yeah. That is the undeniable fingerprint of automated bot networks and paid amplification.
So it's not real people. And the broadcast claims this artificial inflation serves a highly destructive dual purpose.
It does.
First, it manipulates the perception of international observers. Like, when Western policymakers look to social media to gauge the voice of the people, these bot-driven trends basically trick them into believing Pahlavi has this universal, monolithic backing.
Right. It hacks the diplomatic algorithm. It creates an illusion of consensus that foreign governments might completely mistake for reality.
But the second purpose is even more insidious, because it directly targets the psychology of the people actually risking their lives inside Iran.
Oh, absolutely.
If you are an activist on the ground, organizing protests and facing the literal threat of execution, and you look online to see a monarchist in exile claiming to be your sole representative, I mean, it is intensely demoralizing.
It really is. And the source argues this artificial noise actively slows down the momentum of the actual revolution by sidelining the very people doing the dying.
Yeah. And building on that critique, the broadcast doesn't just stop at tearing down his social media strategy. It fundamentally attacks his structural blueprint for a post-regime Iran.
Yeah, Hesami breaks down Pahlavi's proposed transitional plan, which, according to the source, requires him to personally hold executive, legislative, and judicial powers for an 8-month period following the fall of the current government.
Wait, hold on. All three branches.
All 3 branches for 8 months.
I mean, the structural flaw in that proposal is glaring. You cannot claim to be building a modern democracy while simultaneously insisting on consolidating all 3 branches of government under one unelected individual.
No, you can't. And the broadcast points out that after this 8-month period of total autocratic control, Pahlavi supposedly plans to offer the public a referendum to choose between a republic or a monarchy.
That is quite the democratic paradox. Holding absolute power while overseeing your own referendum on whether you should get to keep it.
Right. So the broadcast frames this not as a transition to democracy, but really as a vehicle for restoring autocracy.
Okay.
And furthermore, Hesami accuses Pahlavi of signaling intentions to immediately suppress Kurdish minority groups upon taking power.
Which, in a deeply diverse country where ethnic minorities make up a massive portion of the population, threatening immediate suppression is a recipe for instant civil war. It's definitely not democratic unity.
Definitely not.
So, having completely dismantled Pahlavi's approach and his structural proposals, what is the actual blueprint this broadcast champions? I mean, if they reject the autocracy of the past and they reject the religious dictatorship of the present, what are the actual mechanics of the future they want to build?
Well, the broadcast heavily promotes the NCRI's 10-point plan.
No.
This is presented as the direct democratic antithesis to the vague promises of the exiled monarchy. The plan is highly specific.
What does it mandate?
It mandates democratic elections within 6 months of the regime's collapse. It explicitly guarantees absolute freedom of the press, strict gender equality in all spheres of public and political life, and constitutional autonomy for minority populations, specifically including the Kurds.
Okay, so really is a complete systemic reboot. And this structural blueprint ties perfectly into the core philosophy that Mr. Partovi emphasizes repeatedly in the broadcast. The phrase no Shah, no Sheikh. And it is so important to understand that no Shah, no Sheikh is not just some catchy slogan engineered for a protest sign. As Partovi points out, it has been the fundamental, non-negotiable architectural principle of this organized resistance for over 20 years.
Right. The phrase is a total rejection of the two autocratic models that have basically defined Iran's modern history.
Yeah.
It means definitively closing the door on the monarchical dictatorship of the past, which is the Shah, while simultaneously tearing down the religious dictatorship of the current clerics, the Sheikh.
So the broadcast argues that true democratic freedom can only exist in the space that is entirely free from both of those historical shadows.
Exactly.
But, for the everyday Iranian caught in the middle of all this, it just must feel incredibly overwhelming.
Oh, I can't even imagine.
We have a collapsing economy, missiles overhead, a regime using executions to hold its fleeing military together. And meanwhile, out in the diaspora, there's this bitter, fundamental clash over what the very definition of a future Iran should even be. It honestly sounds like total chaos.
You'd think so, but surprisingly, the source views this intense polarization through a very different lens.
Really? How so?
Partovi argues that this ideological clash isn't chaos at all. He says it is actually a sign of profound political maturity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, according to the broadcast, after 120 years of historical struggle against absolute monarchs and absolute clerics, the Iranian opposition has finally sifted itself into clear, distinct camps. The intellectual and political lines are definitively drawn.
I see. So it forces people to choose a tangible blueprint rather than just, uniting vaguely against the current regime.
Exactly.
You have the faction that wants to look backward and restore a centralized monarchical power structure versus the faction that wants to look forward to a decentralized secular democratic republic.
And the broadcast uses the regime's own lethal behavior as the ultimate proof of which vision is actually viable. Partovi points out a really critical fact here. The regime is not utilizing its failing resources to execute the supporters of the exiled royals.
Right. They are executing members of the PMOI.
Precisely. The source argues this clearly demonstrates who the regime genuinely fears.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The state apparatus knows that a decentralized, organized resistance with a clear democratic blueprint operating inside the country is an existential threat. Whereas an exiled prince with an artificially inflated social media following is, well, merely a distraction.
That observation really brings the entire narrative of this source full circle.
Yeah.
I mean, we began this deep dive looking at the grim, immediate reality of executions in a war-torn nation, and we have traced the logic of those executions all the way to a fierce ideological battle playing out at international conferences and across algorithmic bot networks.
It's all connected.
It is. It is a powerful reminder to you listening that whenever you read a headline about the crisis in Iran, there is an incredibly deep historical fracture within the opposition right beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Understanding the mechanics of that fracture, who is proposing what and how they actually plan to achieve it is absolutely vital to seeing the complete picture of what is happening.
And as we synthesize everything presented in this Radio Irava broadcast today, it really leaves us with a profound, lingering dilemma about how the international community engages with movements in exile.
Yeah.
When a nation is literally cut off from the outside world by internet blackouts, severe censorship, and just the fog of an intensifying war, how do the democratic nations of the world decide which exiled voices truly represent the silenced majority back home?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is, and perhaps more importantly, what happens to the future of a nation when the diaspora's polished vision fundamentally collides with the lived, bleeding reality of those actually fighting on the ground?
That is the defining question for the future of the region. I mean, it is one thing to draft a blueprint from a safe distance, but it is entirely another to build it while the ground is actively shaking beneath you. Thank you for joining us as we unpack these sources today. We will catch you on the next deep dive.